AUKUS intensified Indo-Pacific tensions, especially over Taiwan and the South China Sea and the East Indian Ocean and ASEAN too. So how will this really impact security in the Indo-Pacific region, and how should Indonesia respond to this? Joining us tonight for this discussion, we have international law and relations expert Hikmahanto Juwana and a senior research fellow with the Center on Asia and Globalization at the National University of Singapore, Evan Laksmana. Pak Hikmahanto, Pak Evan, thank you for joining us tonight. I'll start with Mas Hikmahanto. AUKUS fear to trigger an arms race between countries that have nuclear weapons in the region, such as China. Now, this is also feared to lead to a new escalation in the region's current tension hotspot, namely the South China Sea, plus a potential for this to lead to a naval Cold War of sorts in the Indo-Pacific region. What's your perspective, Pak Hikmahanto?
Yes, I do agree that it will create an arms race between the powers. In one hand, China and the US and its ally. But the worst thing is, the Southeast Asia region will be the battleground. So Indonesia will be exposed, and other countries within the Southeast Asian will be exposed to if the hot war broke up. So this is a concern that Indonesia needs to voice. Secondly, Indonesia needs to voice also that there is a potential for a violations of the non-proliferation treaty by Australia and by the US and UK, who have the nuclear capacity.
Evan, what's your take on this?
I think the AUKUS pact is not the beginning of an arms race. I think we've already been in the middle of an arms race at the regional level for about 5-10 years now. So the pact is only merely the latest round of reaction and counter-reaction in terms of regional uncertainty and military buildup. So in that sense, AUKUS did not cause an arms race. We've already been in an arms race for about 5-10 years now. Secondly, I agree with Pak Hikmahanto that Indonesia and Southeast Asia in general, I think, are literally caught in the middle. We are unlikely to choose one side, but geostrategically, if there were to be a conflict between, let's say, the US and China, in which Australia will be involved, we literally will be in the middle. How the conflicting parties reach each other would likely go through our waterways and airspace. So it is very much in Indonesia's interest to ensure that not only the arms race situation can be addressed and toned down, but it is also in our interest to make sure that regional conflict does not happen in the future. And in this particular instance, I'm afraid we haven't been up to the challenge, because all we've been proposing is through multilateral arrangements and norms exercises under ASEAN. And that is an unsuited tool for the current geostrategic realities.
Now, we are very much familiar all these years with the US and the UK pact together, but now this so-called trilateral alliance putting Australia in the picture is highlighted in this one. So much so that it has also angered one of US's closest allies, France, over the backed-out nuclear submarine deal. But Australia says it will maintain its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Should we believe this, Evan?
I think in international politics, words and deeds are not always the same thing, in particular with regards to future commitments. And we've seen this in the past when we have potential violations of the NPT with regards to Israel and India, for example, and yet the enforcement has been less harsh compared to, let's say, Iran. So there is a little bit of a selective enforcement of the NPT that one could say might be different in the case of Australia, because Australia has stated publicly it's not interested in a nuclear weapon per se. But of course, the technology that comes with a nuclear-powered submarine in the future could be potentially converted into a nuclear weapon capacity. But right now, of course, that's not in the table. But of course, things can change within the next a decade or so.
Mas Hikmahanto, we have seen that Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has assured and met directly with President Joko Widodo, saying that nothing is to be feared. How should Indonesia respond to this?
I think Indonesia should not be naive. One, Indonesia should not believe what the words of Scott Morrison. And this is because, politicians come and go. We do not know whether the next prime minister in Australia will committed with the Scott Morrison's government. Whether the next government would be more, tend towards the arms race within the region. So I think Indonesia should have a say on this issue, and we should say that Australia should halt its project of the submarine powered by nuclear. Whatever the reason is, it should not be continued, the project.
Well, if we quote former Australian ambassador to the U.S., Joe Hockey, who boldly declared that AUKUS was intended to counter not only China's power in the Indo-Pacific region, but Russia's too. So talk about escalation here. Do you agree that this signals a new escalation in the region, Mas Hikmahanto?
Well, I do not see the presence of Russia, even though it may be here, but the presence is not clear enough. It is not like China, the presence in Indo-Pacific. So I'm not really sure whether the pact, the AUKUS is intended not only to China, but also to Russia. And the question is whether Russia have the quote-unquote power to pursue its interests within the Indo-Pacific. I mean, Russia is not Soviet Union anymore.
Evan, agree, disagree?
I think it's definitely true that Russia's primary strategic theater of interest still is in Europe and not necessarily in the Indo-Pacific. So in that sense, I think I wouldn't call it that the AUKUS is directly for both China and Russia. I think certainly China is more of the direct purpose for the pact. But of course, the ability of the UK to deploy far away from its territory, and if potentially in between now and Australia receiving the submarines, there have been conversations about the UK deploying its submarines inside Australian waters. That means it would necessarily increase the UK's second strike capability and deterrence in Europe as well. So it does have some indirect implications for Russia, but I'm not sure if the pact was directly, specifically created to target both China and Russia.
We're talking about AUKUS, Australia's nuclear power submarine, and the impact on security in the Indo-Pacific region. We'll continue this conversation after the break. Stay with us here on Asia Prime. You're watching Asia Prime as we resume our talks this evening regarding AUKUS and how will this really impact security in the Indo-Pacific region. We have international law and relations expert Hikmahanto Juwana and senior research fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization at the National University of Singapore, Evan Laksmana. Now, I would like to touch on the establishment of AUKUS, reaffirming the fact that the cornerstone of Washington's China containment strategy is pitched in the Indo-Pacific zone, while they leave Afghanistan to destabilize China's land-based so-called Belt and Road Initiative, while AUKUS are seen as tools in countering China's maritime threat in the Indo-Pacific zone. Evan, do you see there's a connection here as far as the U.S. motives are concerned between what they did leaving Afghanistan, letting the Taliban there take power. And less than a month later, here we are. We have this trilateral alliance between the US, the UK, and Australia.
I think we have to keep in mind as well that the AUKUS pact is not primarily about the nuclear submarines. That's only one component. The larger pact in terms of defense technology sharing, cyber technology, AI, those are long-term defense sharing arrangements that I think have far-reaching consequences than whether or not the U.S. is in Afghanistan or is the U.S. in the maritime sphere of the Indo-Pacific. And bearing in mind as well that leaving Afghanistan in such an abrupt manner also caused a lot of problems for India, a key U.S. strategic partner with regards to the Indo-Pacific security. So I think in some ways, the Afghanistan wasn't, the withdrawal, wasn't particularly designed very well, but there's certainly more detrimental effects for U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific, which is why I think with regards to the AUKUS pact, the issue isn't necessarily the maritime versus land-based. The issue is to what extent those defense technology sharing will increase the capability of regional countries like Australia, and to what extent will China respond. And at this point, we've seen from the various statements, China has not been particularly happy. The key problem is that China's unhappiness will not be expressed directly against those three countries, but likely to be against Southeast Asian countries, particularly in the South China Sea. So this is, I think, one of the downsides of AUKUS for regional security in Southeast Asia.
And speaking of the Chinese anger, Evan, quoting the statement coming out of them regarding the alliance here, that they even made a so-called threat to Australia, being a nuclear target should there be an open conflict. How serious is this threat, do you think?
Well, first of all, the Global Times from China isn't really always believable because they're very hard blusters and necessarily representing fringe groups within the PLA. But the point is, there's certainly anger, but I doubt China is serious about launching a first strike nuclear capability against Australia in the region, which will destroy its own particular region. But I'm not sure Australia is already prepared for this. I think over the last few years, the relationship between Australia and China has already gone down the hill. So bluster in the press and threats are not new for the bilateral relationship.
All right, talking about the Indo-Pacific region, we must discuss about ASEAN. Pak Hikmahanto, ASEAN we know as the principle of maintaining the region as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. However, it sees AUKUS in different perspectives. Indonesia, Malaysia are concerned, while Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines welcome it with arms wide open. How do you see this, Pak Hikmahanto?
Well, I see this as a split in the ASEAN countries' perspective on this issue. And it would be very difficult for ASEAN to have a one say on this issue. And probably I can add that countries such as Cambodia and Laos may be supporting the view of the Chinese government. Rather than the US government. But this is all because every ASEAN countries have interests. We know that the Philippines, under the President Duterte, he was very upset when China, based on the claim of 9-line, came into the territory of territorial waters of the Philippines. So it is natural for the Philippines to say that they welcome the AUKUS. However, of course, Indonesia may have a different view, and we don't have any interest. We don't have any dispute with China, even though, we always say that we do not recognize the 9-line. That's why we said that we don't have any dispute with China. So our concern is the issue of whether the NPT has been violated by these countries. And you have to bear in mind a country like Iran and North Korea is being sanctioned by the United Nations because they have been exposed to nuclear weapons. And why is it that when it comes to the U.S. And the U.S. have interest, and as if U.S. can violate the NPT, and what is very sad is Australia is doing the same. So morally, this is wrong, and morally, Indonesia has to say something about this.
All right, so speaking of the biggest country in ASEAN, Indonesia, I'd like to get a viewpoint from both of you. I'll start with Pak Hikmahanto. Talk about Indonesia still sticking to the so-called old passive tactics, referring to be a so-called balance between the two great powers, taking sort of like a middle point stance in this one, as Indonesia has been famously known all these years. But do you think in this particular issue, this strategy is still relevant? I'll start with you, Pak Hikmahanto.
No, I don't think this is relevant. I think Indonesia has to make a clear statement, bold statement, that Indonesia does not agree with the submarine project, and the project has to be terminated. And it is because NPT is being violated, and then it may create the arms race, and Southeast Asia becomes the battleground. If the U.S. does not stop this project with Australia and UK, then Indonesia, of course, can say that in this issue we have to be with China. This is the thing that Indonesia should do. The foreign minister have to, make a clear statement on this issue.
Evan, your take on Indonesia's stance?
I think as a matter of principle, being in the middle, trying to be balanced and not choosing, I think it's fine as a matter of principle. But the issue is in terms of strategy and efforts of how we can stay in the middle without making the regional environment worse. And so far, we've been standing on the sidelines without being actively involved. And this is tricky. When we're not actively involved in shaping the regional order, we can't really blame other countries for developing their own strategic options, especially outside of the ASEAN framework. The question with Indonesia is that if we demand the program to be stopped, number one, what is it exactly that we're offering to Australia or to the US or to the UK on how to address the problem of China's growing military assertiveness in the region? And ASEAN isn't going to cut it. So I'm not sure we have anything to offer other than expressions of concern, and perhaps quietly we believe that an American presence could counterbalance a Chinese military presence. But all in all, Indonesia's principle of trying to be in the middle is fine, but we haven't had a good strategy and a good resources and a good playbook on how to make sure that we don't have to choose in the first place, but at the same time, the regional environment can still remain stable in the long run.
Well, what should be the good strategy? What should be the good playbook, Evan?
I think, first of all, we have to agree to accept that ASEAN is simply a norms exercise option. We can't always say ASEAN for every single regional security problem. South China Sea, ASEAN. Nuclear problem, ASEAN. We have to stop saying ASEAN as the first instinct. Secondly, we ourselves need to increase our own defense capability as well as diplomatic capability to actively shape the regional order and develop much more stronger, robust response against China. For example, in the South China Sea, it's time to stop saying ASEAN and focus on our ability to work with Vietnam and Malaysia to counter the problems in the North Natuna Sea, for example. So I believe there are a range of options that Indonesia can and should be doing rather than simply staying on the sidelines.
All right.
Sorry.
Pak Hikmahanto, go ahead.
I was going to say that I don't quite agree with what Evan is saying, because Indonesia, we can see two countries they're competing each other, trying to get influence. We don't mind about that, but when it comes to nuclear issue, then we have to have a say on this issue. Yes, probably we don't have any alternative, but what we want to have is the region without arms race, especially nuclear arms race. that has to be stopped and should not be continued by this, rivalry between the U.S. and the U.K. Please, I'm sorry, U.S. and China. Please bear in mind that the United States does not have the financial resources as it used to when it countered the Soviet Union. So that's why the U.S. is trying to have their allies to do burden sharing, in this case, Australia. But again, as I mentioned, this is not right. I was surprised that this kind of policy came from the Joe Biden administration. If it came from Donald Trump, I can understand. But again, this is beyond my logic that it comes from Joe Biden.
All right, we'll just leave it at that as our time is up, as my producer has told me. In the meantime, I would like to thank you for sharing your viewpoints with us tonight. International Law and Relations expert Hikmahanto Juwana, and also Senior Research Fellow with the Center on Asia and Globalization at the National University of Singapore, Evan Laksmana. Stay with us on Asia Prime. We'll be back after the break.